In the spring of 1887, the Hartwell family from rural Pennsylvania made a discovery right underneath their farmhouse, and that discovery ended up splitting their entire community apart for decades. What they found beneath those old floorboards wasn't treasure, it wasn't bones, and it wasn't anything simple or easy to explain. It was something far more disturbing. A careful, methodical hiding job that proved someone inside their own home had been burying a truth so huge that they built an entire second floor just to cover it up. The one question that haunted everybody who heard about it was simple but impossible to answer. What were they so desperate to hide? And just how long had they been hiding it? Before we get deeper into the story of the Hartwell family and the secrets buried under their home, if you're listening from Pennsylvania or any of the nearby states, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what state you're listening from. And if you've ever heard whispers of old family secrets in your own town, go ahead and subscribe to the Fear Sermon channel, hit that notification bell, and let's dig into this mystery together. The Hartwell property sat on 80 acres of rolling farmland right near the border between Lancaster and Lebanon counties. It was one of those places where the landscape rolled in gentle waves and the forests pressed up close against the cleared fields. The main house had been built back in 1823 by a man named Nathaniel Hartwell. His name showed up in county records so often that it suggested he was both prosperous and very careful. He bought the land from a family called Clean, who had left it pretty suddenly in 1821 after a fire burned down their original home. The Hartwell house that replaced the Clean place was built with stone foundations and timber framing, the kind of solid construction meant to last for generations. The stone foundation was laid by masons brought in from Lancaster, skilled workers who understood the tricky challenges of building on Pennsylvania's rolling hills. The limestone came from quarries only 10 miles away, and the workers took their time making sure each stone fit right and the mortar between them would hold for centuries. The timber for the frame came right off the property itself, huge oak and chestnut trees cut down and milled on site. The wood was aged before they used it, a practice that was getting less common by the 1820s, but Nathaniel Hartwell insisted on it because he believed aged wood resisted rot and warping way better than freshly cut timber. By 1887, the house had passed down through 3 generations of Hartwells. The person living there now was Thomas Hartwell, a 63-year-old man who inherited the farm from his father Samuel in 1869. Thomas was a methodical farmer, the kind of guy who kept detailed records of crop yields and livestock counts. He went to the Methodist church in town every Sunday without fail and had married late in life to a woman named Catherine, who was 20 years younger than him. They didn't have any children together, though Thomas had 2 adult sons from his first marriage. Both of those boys had moved west to Ohio and barely had any contact with their father. The relationship between Thomas and his sons had been strained for years, ever since their mother died back in 1856. Thomas remarried within 2 years, and his sons saw that as a betrayal of their mother's memory. The older son, William, left for Ohio in 1860, taking a clerk job at a store in Columbus. The younger son, Robert, followed 3 years later, looking for work in the growing industrial sector. Neither of them ever came back to Pennsylvania except for quick visits, and both made it clear they had no interest in inheriting the family farm. Catherine Hartwell was the kind of woman who got attention without seeming to chase it. She was smart, well-read, and came from a merchant family in Philadelphia before getting married. Neighbors noticed she seemed a little out of place in the rural community. She kept to herself more than most, and she had this strange habit of walking the property alone early in the mornings, often carrying a leather journal she'd write in while sitting under the old oak trees. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was distant in a way that made you think her mind was always somewhere else, something occupying her thoughts even while she did her chores as a farmer's wife. Catherine had been married once before to a lawyer named Richard Ashton from Philadelphia, who died in 1878 from pneumonia complications. That marriage lasted only 4 years, and Catherine was a widow for 7 years before she married Thomas Hartwell. She had no kids from her first marriage, and people in the community wondered why a woman as smart and seemingly well-off as her would choose to marry a rural farmer nearly 20 years older. Some figured she married for security because her first husband hadn't left her much money. Others thought she was just lonely. A few, more mean-spirited, whispered she married because no other man of suitable status would have her. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story place with a wraparound porch, the kind of home that looked both welcoming and somehow guarded. Inside, it was laid out like most homes back then. A big kitchen and dining area on the ground floor, a parlor for guests, and several bedrooms upstairs. The cellar underneath was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, and that's where the family stored root vegetables, preserved goods, and their tools. The floorboards in the main living area were original to the house, worn smooth by decades of footsteps and kept up with regular oiling and careful sweeping. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a big room with a cast iron stove installed in the 1860s that replaced the original fireplace. The walls were painted a pale cream color, and the windows faced east toward the fields where the morning sun would pour in early each day. And it was in that kitchen on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1887 that everything changed. That spring, a section of the kitchen floor near the eastern wall started showing signs of rot. The boards began to warp, and there was a faint smell of dampness that suggested water damage from the spring thaw. The winter had been brutally harsh that year, with heavy snows and temperatures that stayed well below freezing for long stretches. The spring thaw was just as bad, with rapid snowmelt causing water to seep into the foundation and push up through the floorboards. Thomas Hartwell, being a practical man, decided the boards had to be replaced. He hired a local carpenter named Henry Voss, a man in his early 40s who'd done work on several homes in the area and was known for being extremely detail-oriented. Voss had a reputation for honesty and good craftsmanship, and he was one of the few tradesmen around who could charge top prices for his work. He learned the trade from his father, who learned it from his father, and the Voss family had been building and fixing homes in Lancaster County for 3 generations. Voss showed up at the Hartwell house on a Tuesday morning in late April, along with his apprentice, a young man named William Clean, a descendant of the family who owned the property before the Hartwells. William was 17, the son of a local blacksmith, and had been Voss's apprentice for just over a year. He was a quick learner, paid close attention to detail, and was eager to master the trade. He was also, as it turned out, the kind of young man who couldn't keep a secret to save his life. Catherine Hartwell seemed unusually nervous about the work. She hovered near the kitchen as the men started prying up the damaged boards, asking over and over if they were sure they couldn't just fix the existing floor instead of replacing it. She even offered to pay extra if they'd avoid removing the boards entirely. Thomas was out in the barn tending to his livestock and wasn't there to hear any of this. He'd left early that morning to check on a sick cow and wouldn't be back until late afternoon. Voss, who was used to homeowners worrying about the hassle and cost of repairs, assured Catherine that the boards had to be replaced. He said trying to repair them would just delay the inevitable, and the sooner they got the work done, the sooner the problem would be solved. He was professional but firm, and Catherine seemed to accept his judgment, even though her anxiety didn't go away. As Voss and his apprentice worked, they found something unexpected. Under the original floorboards, there was another layer, a second floor made from different wood and showing signs of age that suggested it had been there for decades. The space between the 2 floors was only about 8 inches deep, but it was enough to hold something. The wood of the lower floor was darker, more weathered, and looked like it had been deliberately covered instead of just abandoned. Voss called out to Catherine and asked if she knew about this hidden space. She came to the kitchen doorway, looked at the exposed gap under the floorboards, and her face went completely pale. She grabbed the doorframe like she needed it to hold herself up. Without answering Voss's question, she turned and went up the stairs to her bedroom, and the sound of the door locking behind her echoed through the house. William Clean, the apprentice, was the one who first reached into that space between the floors. He was young, curious, and not old enough yet to understand the importance of keeping quiet. His hand came back holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric was yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. The oilcloth had been carefully folded and tied with twine that had long since hardened and snapped. Inside the wrapping, there was clearly something substantial, papers by the look of it, written documents of some kind. Voss took the bundle carefully from his apprentice's hands and started unwrapping it slowly, pulling away layer after layer of yellowed oilcloth. Inside were documents, letters written in a careful hand on paper that had yellowed but was still readable. The ink had faded some, but the words were still clear. Voss read the first letter in silence, and his expression got darker with every line. When he finished, he looked at his apprentice and said, "We need to stop work. We need to tell Mr. Hartwell what we found." But before they could leave the kitchen, Catherine Hartwell showed up again at the top of the stairs. She had changed her dress and pulled herself together, but her eyes were red and her hands were trembling a little. She came down the stairs slowly and deliberately, and when she reached the kitchen floor, she looked straight at Henry Voss and said, "Those documents are private property. They belong to this household, and I must insist you hand them over immediately." Voss wasn't a man easily intimidated. He held the bundle tight and said, "Mrs. Hartwell, if these documents contain evidence of something illegal, they can't stay private. I have a responsibility." "You have a responsibility to do the work you were hired for," Catherine cut in, her voice now steady and almost cold. "And that work is finished. I'll pay you for your time, and I'll expect your discretion about what you found. What's in those documents is a family matter, nothing more." William Clean, sensing the tension, moved toward the door. But Voss stood his ground, still holding the bundle. "I can't in good conscience ignore what I've seen," he said quietly. "If there's wrongdoing, there is no wrongdoing," Catherine said. "There's only a family trying to protect itself from the judgment of people who wouldn't understand the circumstances. I'm asking you as a man of conscience to respect that." What happened next was a negotiation held in the tense kitchen with spring sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of old wood and damp earth filling the air. Voss looked at the bundle in his hands, then at Catherine's face, and something in her expression, not a threat but a deep sadness, seemed to reach him. He asked her one question. "Is anyone in danger?" Catherine took a long moment before answering. "No," she said finally. "No one is in danger. Not anymore." Voss wrapped the documents back up carefully and handed them to Catherine. He told her he'd finished the floorboards, but that he needed to talk to her husband about the hidden space. Catherine nodded, accepting that condition. She took the bundle and held it against her chest like something precious and fragile. When Thomas Hartwell got back from the barn that afternoon, boots muddy and shirt stained from the day's work, he found Henry Voss waiting in the kitchen. Catherine was nowhere to be seen. Voss told Thomas what they'd discovered, speaking in a low voice and picking his words carefully. He explained about the hidden space under the floorboards, about the documents wrapped in oilcloth, about Catherine insisting they stay private. Thomas didn't react with shock or anger. Instead, he had this weary, resigned look, like he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking off his boots, which was unusual for him and suggested his mind was elsewhere. He asked to see the documents, and Catherine, who'd been listening from the parlor, came out and handed them over without arguing. Thomas read them in silence, sitting at the kitchen table while his wife stood nearby watching him with a hard-to-read expression. The documents were numerous. There were letters, some dating back to the 1860s, and also what looked like ledgers or account books filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes. As Thomas read, his face stayed blank, but his hands trembled slightly, and at one point he closed his eyes like the words on the page were causing him actual pain. After he finished, Thomas Hartwell looked at Henry Voss and said, "I'll pay you double your usual rate for your silence about this. The floorboards will get finished, and you'll speak to no one about what you found." "Understood." Voss agreed, though he did so with clear reluctance. He was a man of principle, and the idea of keeping secrets about possible wrongdoing bothered him. But he also understood the weight of what Thomas was asking, and he recognized that sometimes discretion was the more honorable path. The work was finished over the next 2 days. New floorboards went in, carefully matched to the old wood and finished to blend perfectly with the rest of the floor. The hidden space was sealed beneath them, and to anyone who didn't know what lay below, the kitchen floor looked exactly like it had before the work started. But the secret, once uncovered, couldn't be contained that easily. William Clean, despite being young and wanting to obey his boss, just couldn't stay quiet about what he'd seen. He was young enough to believe that secrets this big should be shared and curious enough to want to understand what he'd witnessed. Within a week, he told his mother, who told her sister, who told the wife of the Methodist minister. Within a month, half the county seemed to know that something unusual had been found under the Hartwell floorboards, though the specifics of what that something was stayed frustratingly vague. The rumors that spread were varied and got more elaborate over time. Some said Thomas Hartwell had hidden money under the floor, gold coins or paper currency he was hiding from creditors or the tax assessor. Others said the documents were proof of cheating, that Catherine had been involved in some scandal before marrying Thomas and he'd found evidence of it. A few whispered that the hidden space held evidence of a crime, a theft, or maybe something darker. The Methodist minister, Reverend Samuel Pritchard, heard the rumors and felt he had to look into it. He was a thoughtful, educated man in his 50s who'd served the local church for nearly 20 years. He'd known Thomas Hartwell most of that time and had married Thomas and Catherine just 5 years earlier. He decided to visit the Hartwell farm and talk to Thomas directly. Thomas received the Reverend in his study, a room lined with books and papers, and was surprisingly open about the general nature of the discovery. He explained that documents had been found under the floorboards, documents related to his father's activities during the Civil War. He didn't go into detail about the specific contents, but he made clear they weren't evidence of any crime on his part and that he was handling things with appropriate discretion. Reverend Pritchard left the farm somewhat reassured but still troubled. He sensed that Thomas was being truthful about the general nature of the discovery but that there was something more, something Thomas wasn't saying, something weighing on his conscience. The Reverend decided not to spread rumors, but he couldn't entirely dismiss his concerns. The Hartwell family responded to the gossip with dignified silence. Thomas and Catherine kept up their routines as if nothing had changed. They went to church. They worked the farm. They welcomed visitors with the same courtesy they'd always shown. But there was a new tension in their interactions, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. Those who knew them well noticed Catherine seemed to have pulled back even more into herself, spending even more time alone, walking the property with her journal. In the summer of 1887, a visitor arrived at the Hartwell farm who would change everything. His name was Edward Vance, a lawyer from Philadelphia who claimed to be a distant relative of Catherine's family. He was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s with gray hair and the bearing of someone used to authority and respect. He showed up without warning, traveling by train from Philadelphia and then hiring a carriage to bring him to the farm. Catherine's reaction was shock, followed by resignation. She greeted him formally, but there was emotion in her voice suggesting she hadn't expected to see him again. She invited him inside, offered him something to drink, then excused herself to tell Thomas about their visitor. Vance stayed for 3 weeks, and during that time he spent long hours talking with Thomas and Catherine, often in the study with the door closed. Neighbors who saw him come and go noted he looked troubled, like he was carrying a weight that grew heavier instead of lighter during his visit. He took walks around the property, sometimes alone and sometimes with Thomas or Catherine. He spent time in the study reading documents and taking notes in a leather journal. The day before he left, Vance met with Henry Voss, the carpenter, at the local tavern. He bought Voss a drink and asked him, carefully and indirectly, what he'd seen under the floorboards. Voss refused to answer, citing his agreement with Thomas Hartwell. But Vance persisted, and eventually he said something that made Voss reconsider his silence. "If what I suspect is true," Vance said, "the documents under those floorboards are evidence of something that reaches far beyond the Hartwell family. There are people who have a right to know the truth. There are people whose lives have been shaped by lies." Voss asked what he meant, but Vance wouldn't elaborate. He left the tavern that evening and went back to Philadelphia. And Voss was left with a growing unease about his decision to stay quiet. It wasn't until the winter of 1888, nearly a year after the discovery, that the full story started to come out. The trigger was an unexpected death. Samuel Hartwell, Thomas's older brother, died at his home in Ohio under circumstances officially ruled as natural causes, heart failure brought on by pneumonia. But in his will, Samuel left a letter to be opened by his brother Thomas. And in that letter, he revealed that he'd always known about the hidden space under the farmhouse floorboards. Samuel's letter explained that the documents hidden there had been placed by their father, Samuel Hartwell Sr., in the years after the Civil War. The elder Samuel had been involved in activities during the war that he wanted to hide from his family and from the law. The nature of those activities, Samuel Jr. wrote, was something Thomas would have to face, because the documents contained evidence that would eventually come to light, and Thomas needed to be ready for the consequences. Samuel Jr. also wrote that he'd carried the burden of this knowledge for many years and often wondered if he should have told Thomas sooner, but he'd respected their father's wishes and believed Thomas would eventually find out on his own. Now that Samuel Jr. was dying, he felt obligated to make sure Thomas understood the full weight of what lay under the floorboards and was prepared to make the right decision about what to do with that knowledge. When Thomas got that letter, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He contacted Edward Vance in Philadelphia and asked him to come back to the farm. When Vance arrived, Thomas handed over the documents from under the floorboards and told him they were no longer bound by secrecy. He only asked that Vance handle the matter discreetly and make sure the truth, whatever it was preserved accurately. Edward Vance spent a week at the Hartwell farm reading the documents carefully and taking notes. He talked with Thomas and Catherine about the contents, asking questions and seeking clarification on unclear points. He also interviewed Henry Voss about what he'd observed and understood about the documents. Voss, now released from his promise to stay silent, gave detailed information about what he'd seen and what Catherine had said that day in April. When Vance finished reviewing the documents, he sat down with Thomas and Catherine and explained what he'd found. The documents, he said, were letters and records detailing the activities of Samuel Hartwell Sr. during the Civil War. The elder Samuel had been involved in what was known as the Underground Railroad, but not in the way history books usually describe it. Samuel Hartwell Sr. had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, yes, but he'd also been something more complicated. During the war years, he sheltered escaped enslaved people on his property, giving them food, clothing, and safe passage north. That wasn't unusual for an abolitionist in Pennsylvania. What was unusual, and what required such careful concealment, was that he'd also been involved in forging documents, freedom papers, passes, and other official-looking certificates that would help people travel more safely through dangerous territory. The documents under the floorboards included detailed records of how many people had been helped, where they'd come from, and where they'd been sent. There were also letters from grateful people describing their new lives in the North and Canada. But there were also letters from people who'd been betrayed, captured, and returned to slavery despite the papers Samuel had given them, people who'd been separated from family and lost in the chaos of war. More troubling still, there were records suggesting Samuel Hartwell Sr. hadn't always been completely honest about the fate of those he claimed to have helped. Some of the people who'd passed through his farm were never heard from again. No letters, no confirmation they'd reached safety, and in a few cases, cryptic notes in Samuel's handwriting suggesting certain individuals had posed a threat to the operation, to the community, or to the Hartwell family itself. One entry from the summer of 1863 read, "The man calling himself James arrived 3 days ago, claiming to be from Virginia. His story matches what we've heard from others, but something about him bothers me. He asks too many questions about our methods, about how we move people north, about who else is involved. I've decided it's not safe to help him further. I gave him money and sent him to another station, but I fear he may be a spy sent by authorities to infiltrate our network." Another entry from the spring of 1864 was even more cryptic. "The woman and her child left yesterday. I had hoped they would reach safety, but I've received word they were caught near the Maryland border. The child was taken from her and sold to a plantation in Georgia. I don't know what became of the woman. I carry the weight of this failure, and I wonder if I made the right decision in helping them at all. Maybe it would have been better to refuse them, to tell them the journey was too dangerous, that their chances were too slim. But how could I do that? How could I look into the eyes of a mother desperate to save her child and tell her I couldn't help?" Edward Vance explained to Thomas that the documents were historically significant, providing a detailed account of Underground Railroad operations in Pennsylvania during a critical period. But they also raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. Had Samuel Hartwell Sr. been responsible for the disappearance of those individuals whose fates were unclear? Had he been involved in something darker than the noble work of helping enslaved people escape to freedom? Or had he simply been a man trying to do good in impossible circumstances, preserving the documents as a record of both his successes and his failures? Thomas Hartwell listened with a face that showed nothing. When Vance finished, Thomas asked one question. "What do you intend to do with this information?" Vance said he believed the documents should be preserved and eventually made available to historians, but he understood the sensitivity of the matter. He was willing to wait, giving Thomas time to decide how the family wanted to proceed. He suggested donating the documents to a historical society or university where they be preserved and studied, but where the family's privacy could also be respected. Catherine, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke. "My husband's father did what he believed was right," she said quietly. "He helped people who were suffering. If there are questions about his methods or his judgment, those are questions history will have to answer. But I don't believe hiding the truth serves anyone. I believe the documents should be preserved, and I believe the story should be told, even if it's complicated and even if it reflects poorly on our family." Thomas looked at his wife for a long moment and then nodded. He told Vance he was willing to let the documents be preserved and studied, but with one condition. They wouldn't be made public during his lifetime or Catherine's. After they died, he said, the documents could be released to whoever wanted to study them. Vance agreed, took the documents with him when he left the farm, and deposited them with a historical society in Philadelphia with instructions that they be sealed and preserved until after Thomas and Catherine Hartwell's deaths. The years after the discovery were marked by quiet resignation in the Hartwell household. Thomas and Catherine continued their lives much as before, but there was a new understanding between them, a shared knowledge of a truth they couldn't speak about openly. The rumors in the community slowly faded, replaced by other gossip and other scandals. The Hartwell family was no longer the focus of intense speculation, though people still wondered, still whispered, still tried to piece together what had been hidden under those floorboards. In 1889, Thomas got a letter from his son William in Ohio. William had heard rumors about the discovery at the farm and was writing to ask his father directly what had been found. Thomas responded with a carefully worded letter explaining that documents related to his father's Civil War activities had been discovered and were being preserved for historical purposes. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't invite further discussion. William, sensing his father's reluctance, didn't push. Robert, the younger son, didn't even ask. He'd long since distanced himself from his father and the farm and had little interest in family history or secrets. He was building his own life in Ohio, working in industry, married with a family of his own. He had no desire to return to Pennsylvania or reconnect with his father. In 1891, Thomas Hartwell had a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He recovered enough to move around the house with help, but his days of running the farm were over. Catherine became his primary caregiver and also took over managing the property. She hired a manager to handle the farm work and devoted herself to her husband's care with a dedication that impressed even those who'd found her distant and cold before. The manager was a man named George Thorne, a farmer in his 50s who'd worked on several local properties and had a reputation for honesty and competence. Thorne lived in a cottage on the property and handled daily farm operations while Catherine managed finances and administration. The arrangement worked well, and the farm stayed productive despite Thomas's illness. During this time, Catherine's journal entries, which wouldn't be discovered until after her death, show a woman wrestling with deep questions about truth, responsibility, and historical memory. She wrote about her husband's father, about the people he'd helped, about the people he'd failed. She wrote about the burden of knowing a secret that couldn't be shared, about the weight of history pressing down on a family that had tried to do good but hadn't always succeeded. One entry from the spring of 1892 reads, "I've been thinking about the people whose names appear in those documents, the ones whose fates are unknown. Are they alive somewhere, living lives they built for themselves? Or did they die, victims of circumstances beyond anyone's control? We'll never know. And maybe that's the cruelest part of this history. Not the secrets themselves, but the unknowing that comes with them. We're left to wonder forever about the lives we touched and the lives we failed to save." Another entry from the summer of 1893 shows Catherine's internal conflict about the decision to preserve the documents. "I've been wondering if we did the right thing letting the documents be preserved. Thomas believes history should know the truth even if it's complicated and even if it reflects badly on his father. I agree with him. But I also understand wanting to protect your family from judgment. Maybe both things can be true at once. Maybe we can honor the truth while also honoring the memory of those who struggled to do right in impossible circumstances." In 1894, Thomas Hartwell died at age 70 from complications of his stroke. Catherine was left as the only surviving member of the household and continued managing the farm with George Thorne's help. She was now in her 50s, still smart and capable, but increasingly isolated from a community that had never fully accepted her. During this period, Catherine started receiving visitors, historians, and researchers who'd somehow learned about the documents under the floorboards and sought her out hoping to gain access. Catherine refused every request, citing the agreement with Edward Vance. But she did talk with some of them, sharing what she could about the Hartwell family history and the work Thomas's father had done. One of these visitors was a young historian named Margaret Ashton, who came to the farm in the summer of 1896. Ashton was researching the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania and had heard rumors about the Hartwell documents. She wrote to Catherine asking for an interview, and to her surprise, Catherine agreed. Margaret Ashton was a woman in her early 30s, educated and smart, with a genuine passion for historical research. She'd published several articles on Underground Railroad history and was working on a book about conductors and the complex moral questions they faced. She'd heard about the Hartwell documents through her research network and believed they could provide valuable insights into Underground Railroad operations in Pennsylvania. Catherine was reluctant at first, but something about Ashton's genuine interest and respectful approach seemed to move her. Over a week-long visit, Catherine told Ashton much of what she knew about the documents and the history they contained. She didn't show the documents themselves, she couldn't because of the agreement with Vance, but she described their contents in detail and answered Ashton's questions as fully as she could. Ashton asked Catherine directly, "Do you believe your husband's father was a good man?" Catherine took a long time to answer. "I believe he was a man who tried to do good in circumstances that were often impossible," she said finally. "I believe he helped people who desperately needed help. I also believe he made decisions that may have caused harm, even if that wasn't his intention. I believe history is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be, and the people who shape history are rarely as purely good or purely evil as we'd like them to be. My husband's father was all of these things, a hero and a flawed human being, sometimes at the same time." Margaret Ashton published an article about the Hartwell family in a historical journal in 1897 based on what Catherine had told her. The article didn't reveal the specific contents of the documents, but it discussed the general nature of the Hartwell family's Underground Railroad involvement and raised questions about the complexity of that historical period. The article was called "The Moral Ambiguity of the Underground Railroad: One Family's Struggle with Conscience and Consequence," and it was read by a small audience of academics and historians. It generated some interest in academic circles and led to several inquiries about the Hartwell documents. But Catherine kept refusing all requests for access, and the documents stayed sealed at the Historical Society in Philadelphia. Another visitor came to the farm in the winter of 1898, a professor of history from the University of Pennsylvania named James Whitmore. Whitmore was interested in the Hartwell documents because he was researching the role of forged documents in the Underground Railroad and believed the Hartwell records could offer valuable insights. Catherine agreed to speak with him and provided information about the nature of the documents and the work Samuel Hartwell Sr. had done. Whitmore was especially interested in the ethical questions around forging documents and asked Catherine if she believed such forgery was justified, even in service of a noble cause. Catherine's response was thoughtful and nuanced. "I believe my husband's father faced impossible choices," she said. "He could have refused to help people seeking freedom, but that would have meant condemning them to slavery. He could have helped them without forging documents, but that would have greatly increased the danger they faced. He chose to forge documents because he believed that was the best way to help people escape to freedom. Whether that choice was justified is a question each person must answer for themselves, based on their own moral framework and understanding of the circumstances." Whitmore left the farm impressed by Catherine's thoughtfulness and her willingness to engage with difficult moral questions. He didn't publish anything about the Hartwell documents, but he mentioned them in his lectures and encouraged his students to think carefully about the moral complexities of the Underground Railroad. Catherine Hartwell died in the winter of 1903 at age 68. She'd been in declining health for several years, and her death wasn't unexpected. In her will, she left the farm to a distant cousin and left her personal effects, including her journal, to Margaret Ashton, the historian who'd visited years before. Ashton received Catherine's journal and letters with a deep sense of responsibility. She read through Catherine's private thoughts, her struggles with the secret she'd carried, her reflections on history and truth and the burden of knowing things that couldn't be shared. And she made a decision that would have major consequences for the historical record. In 1905, 2 years after Catherine's death, Ashton contacted the Historical Society in Philadelphia where the Hartwell documents had been deposited. She told them both Thomas and Catherine Hartwell were now deceased and asked that the documents be released for proper study and preservation. The Historical Society, after consulting with Edward Vance, who was still alive but in his 80s, agreed. The documents were made available to researchers in 1906 and immediately attracted significant attention from historians studying the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. Scholars began analyzing the records, cross-referencing them with other historical sources, and piecing together a fuller picture of the Hartwell family's activities during the war years. What emerged was a complex and sometimes troubling portrait of Samuel Hartwell Sr. and his work. It became clear he'd indeed helped many people escape from slavery and that his work was significant and courageous. But it also became clear that some of the people he'd claimed to help never reached their intended destinations, and the circumstances of their disappearances remained mysterious. Some historians suggested these individuals had been captured by slave catchers and returned to the South, a tragic but not uncommon outcome. Others suggested they'd just moved on, lost to history, their fates unknown. A few, more speculatively, suggested Samuel Hartwell Sr. might have been involved in something darker, though they admitted the evidence for that was circumstantial at best. The documents also revealed that Samuel Hartwell Sr. had kept detailed financial records of his Underground Railroad activities, including payments he'd received for his work. This raised questions about whether his motivations were purely humanitarian or if he'd been profiting from the desperation of enslaved people seeking freedom. Again, historians debated the significance of this finding, some arguing it was reasonable to be compensated for the significant risks and expenses involved, others suggesting it complicated the narrative of pure altruism. As the decades passed into the 20th century, the Hartwell documents became an important resource for historians, but also a source of ongoing debate and speculation. The documents themselves were clear and detailed, but they raised as many questions as they answered. The people who'd disappeared, whose names appeared in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s records but were never heard from again, became a historical mystery, a puzzle researchers tried to solve but never quite could. In the 1960s, a researcher named David Brenner became obsessed with the Hartwell documents. He spent years trying to trace the fates of the individuals whose disappearances were recorded in Samuel's notes. He traveled south searching through slave auction records and plantation documents. He interviewed descendants of enslaved people, looking for any mention of individuals matching the names in the Hartwell records. He consulted with other historians, comparing notes and theories. Brenner's research was meticulous and thorough, but it ultimately yielded more questions than answers. He found evidence that some of the missing individuals had indeed been captured and returned to slavery. He found evidence that others had successfully reached the North and established lives there, though they'd left no record of their journey. And for a few, he found no evidence at all, no trace of them in any historical record, no indication of what had become of them. In his final publication on the subject, Brenner wrote, "The Hartwell documents give us a window into Underground Railroad operations in Pennsylvania during the Civil War era. They also give us a mystery that may never be fully solved. The disappearances recorded in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s notes may have been the result of capture and return to slavery, of successful escape and assimilation into northern communities, or of death from disease, accident, or other causes. Without more evidence, we can't determine which fate befell the missing individuals. What we can say for certain is that their names were recorded, they were real people whose lives mattered, and their stories deserve to be remembered, even if the details of their fates remain unknown." The Hartwell farmhouse itself stayed standing for many decades after the family's involvement ended. The property changed hands several times, passing to owners who either knew nothing of its history or knew only vague rumors about hidden documents and family secrets. The house was maintained reasonably well, though like all old structures, it gradually showed signs of age and wear. In the 1970s, the house was bought by a historical preservation society that recognized its significance and started a careful restoration. During that restoration, workers found more evidence of the hidden space under the floorboards. They found traces of the original construction, marks on the joists suggesting how the false floor had been installed, and fragments of the oilcloth that had wrapped the documents. They also found something else. A small compartment in the cellar wall, hidden behind a loose stone, containing a single letter written in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s handwriting. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this, and was dated 1868, 2 years after the Civil War ended. In it, Samuel Hartwell Sr. explained his reasons for hiding the documents under the floorboards. He wrote that he'd been involved in work he believed was morally justified, but he also recognized his methods hadn't always been pure, that he'd made decisions he regretted, and that he'd failed some of the people who depended on him. "I am placing these documents where they will be found," he wrote. "Not because I wish to hide them forever, but because I believe the truth about what happened during these years is too complicated and too painful to be revealed while I am alive. I hope future generations, with the benefit of time and distance, will be able to understand not just what I did but why I did it, and will judge my actions with compassion and understanding. I also hope they will remember the people whose names appear in these documents, the people I helped and the people I failed, and that they will understand that history is not always a simple story of good and evil, but rather a complex tapestry of human choices, human failures, and human struggles." The letter continued with a more personal reflection. "I have lived with the weight of my decisions for many years now. I have asked myself countless times whether I did enough, whether I could have done more, whether I made the right choices in the moments when I had to decide. I don't have answers to these questions. What I do know is that I tried. I tried to help people who were suffering, and I tried to do so in a way that would maximize their chances of reaching safety. I also know that I failed sometimes, that my efforts weren't always successful, and that people suffered as a result of my failures. This knowledge will stay with me until the end of my days." That letter was preserved along with the other documents and became one of the most poignant pieces of evidence in the Hartwell archive. It suggested Samuel Hartwell Sr. had been aware of the moral complexity of his own actions, understood the weight of his decisions, and hoped future generations could understand his story in all its complexity. Today, the Hartwell farmhouse stands as a museum and historical site, open to visitors who want to learn about the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania and the Hartwell family's role in that history. The floorboards have been carefully preserved, and visitors can see the space where the documents were hidden, walk on the same boards Thomas and Catherine walked on, stand in the kitchen where Henry Voss made the discovery that changed everything. The documents themselves are housed in a climate-controlled archive, preserved for future generations of researchers. Historians continue to study them, debate their significance, and try to piece together the stories of the people whose names appear in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s records. But the mystery remains. The people who disappeared, whose names were recorded but fates never confirmed, continue to haunt the historical record. Were they captured and returned to slavery? Did they escape and build new lives in the North? Did they die along the way? The documents don't tell us, and maybe they never will. What we do know is that the Hartwell family made a choice to hide the truth, and that choice had consequences that rippled through generations. We know Thomas Hartwell inherited a secret that wasn't his own, carried it until his death, and ultimately chose to release it so history could be preserved and studied. We know Catherine Hartwell struggled with the burden of knowing a truth that couldn't be shared and ultimately supported letting the documents be revealed. And we know that under the floorboards of an ordinary farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, there lay a second layer, not just of wood and nails, but of history, of secrets, of human choices and human failures, of the complicated legacy of a nation trying to reckon with the sin of slavery and the courage of those who resisted it. The story of the Hartwell family reminds us that history isn't always as simple as we'd like it to be. It reminds us that the people who shape history are often flawed, often struggling with moral questions that have no easy answers, often making decisions with unintended consequences. It reminds us that the truth, when finally revealed, is often more complicated and more troubling than the rumors and speculation that came before it. But it also reminds us that the truth matters. It reminds us that the stories of ordinary people, the people whose names appear in historical documents, the people who lived through extraordinary times and made choices that echoed through generations, deserve to be remembered, studied, and understood. It reminds us that history isn't just about great events and famous figures, but about the choices made by individuals in their homes and communities, choices that had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. The Hartwell documents remain one of the most important sources for understanding the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. They give us names, dates, and details that help reconstruct the lives of people who were seeking freedom. They also give us a mystery, the mystery of the people who disappeared, whose fates remain unknown, whose stories are incomplete. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. History is not a closed book. It's an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, a constant effort to understand the people who came before us, to honor their struggles and sacrifices, and to learn from their choices and failures. The documents under the Hartwell floorboards are part of that conversation, and they'll keep speaking to future generations long after everyone who knew the Hartwell family has passed away. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the truth should always be revealed, no matter how complicated or troubling it might be? Or do you think there are times when secrets should be kept, when the burden of knowing the truth is just too heavy to carry? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this from the Fear Sermon, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries and history. See you in the next one.